The most dangerous messages are not the ones sent in anger. They are the ones sent with a smile. The text arrived at exactly 10:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, while I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, finishing a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. Outside, the Dallas sky was dark and quiet. The neighborhood had settled into the familiar rhythm of suburban Texas evenings. Porch lights glowed across the street. Sprinkler systems clicked somewhere in the distance. Everything felt normal. Then my phone vibrated. I glanced down and saw Rebecca's name. My wife and I had been married for 21 years. Long enough to finish each other's sentences. Long enough to know each other's habits. Long enough to recognize when something had changed. I opened the message expecting something ordinary. Maybe a reminder about the weekend. Maybe a grocery list. Instead, I read a sentence that made me stare at the screen for several seconds. Going on a solo trip with Daniel next week. Do not be jealous. That was it. No explanation. No discussion. No question. Just a decision already made. Daniel Brooks. Her first love. The man whose name had appeared more frequently over the last 6 months than it had during the previous 20 years combined. I read the message again. Then a third time. Most people probably imagine a moment like that ending with shouting, accusations, or a dramatic phone call. It did not. I simply set the phone down and looked out the kitchen window. The reflection staring back at me looked surprisingly calm. My name is Michael Carter. I am 49 years old. I have spent most of my life believing that important decisions should be made after emotions cool down. That habit has saved me more times than I can count. Upstairs, the empty side of our bed suddenly felt symbolic. Rebecca was not home. She had spent the evening with friends, or at least that was what she told me earlier. The truth was that I no longer knew which details were facts and which were carefully edited versions of reality. 6 months earlier, Daniel had reappeared through social media. According to Rebecca, it was completely innocent. A harmless conversation. An old friend. Reconnecting after years apart. Then came the phone calls. Then came the text messages. Then came the stories. Every conversation somehow circled back to Daniel. Daniel's new job. Daniel's recent divorce. Daniel's travel plans. Daniel's opinions. Daniel's memories. It was remarkable how much space a person could occupy in a marriage without physically entering the room. I picked up my phone again and read her message one more time. Going on a solo trip with Daniel next week. Do not be jealous. The phrase that interested me most was not Daniel's name. It was the confidence. She was not asking whether I was comfortable with it. She was informing me. Somewhere along the way, she had become completely certain about how I would respond. She expected frustration, maybe disappointment, maybe an argument. What she did not expect was silence. I opened our previous messages and scrolled through weeks of conversations. Small clues suddenly looked larger. Delayed replies, increased privacy, conversations that ended the moment I entered a room. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would stand up as evidence in a courtroom, just enough to create a pattern. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Rebecca. You know there is nothing to worry about. I stared at the words and almost smiled. People rarely say there is nothing to worry about unless they know exactly what someone will worry about. Still, I did not respond. Instead, I locked the screen and placed the phone face down on the table. The house was completely quiet now. The refrigerator hummed softly. A clock ticked above the stove. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet something inside me had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. Because for the first time in a very long time, I stopped focusing on what Rebecca was doing and started paying attention to what it meant. Somewhere between the first text and the second, a question had entered my mind. It was not whether she would go on the trip. It was not whether Daniel still mattered to her. It was something much simpler. Why was I the only person in this marriage still pretending that boundaries did not matter? The strange part was not the message itself. The strange part was how little it surprised me. I slept for almost 6 hours that night, which was probably 6 hours more than most people expected. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was already spilling across the kitchen floor. The coffee maker clicked softly beside me as I stood at the counter staring out toward the backyard. Everything looked normal. The oak trees, the wooden fence, the small garden Rebecca used to care about before her weekends became increasingly occupied by other priorities. From the outside, our life still looked successful. 21 years of marriage. A beautiful home in a quiet Dallas neighborhood. Financial stability. Shared history. Family photographs lining the hallway. The kind of life people assume is solid simply because it has existed for a long time. The truth is that some foundations crack long before the building starts leaning. Rebecca came downstairs around 7:30 wearing workout clothes and carrying her phone. She looked refreshed, relaxed, almost cheerful. If she felt any concern about the message she had sent the night before, she hid it well. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She poured herself coffee and sat across from me. For a few moments we discussed ordinary things. Weather forecasts, weekend plans, a restaurant someone had recommended. Then she glanced at me carefully, waiting, expecting, looking for the reaction she assumed would eventually arrive. When it did not, she finally brought it up herself. "Did you see my message?" she asked. I nodded. "I did." She waited. I took another sip of coffee. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That is all," she asked. "What else should I say?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. Not guilt, not regret, confusion. She had prepared herself for resistance. She had not prepared herself for calm. "Michael, you know it is just a trip." "I heard you." She set her coffee cup down. "Daniel and I have been friends for months." Friends. It was interesting how often people relied on that word when they wanted to avoid discussing everything around it. I remembered the late-night messages, the constant notifications, the private conversations that somehow never seemed appropriate to share openly. None of those details matched the simplicity of the word friends. Still, I did not argue. Rebecca continued. "You trust me, right?" There are questions that sound simple, but are actually traps. This was one of them. If I said yes, the discussion ended immediately. If I said no, I became the problem. So instead I answered honestly. Trust and boundaries are not the same thing. The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Rebecca looked away first. "You are overthinking this." Maybe. Or maybe I had spent too many months underthinking it. That possibility seemed far more likely. Later that morning she left for a brunch gathering with friends. The moment her car disappeared down the street, I walked back inside and sat at the dining room table. Not because I was angry, because I was finally paying attention. I opened my laptop and reviewed our household finances, then our property records, then our investment accounts. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, just information. Facts have a way of cutting through emotional fog. By noon I found myself looking at our marriage differently than I had 24 hours earlier. Not because of Daniel. Daniel was merely a symptom. The real issue was something else. Rebecca no longer seemed concerned about how her choices affected our relationship. Somewhere along the way, she had become comfortable assuming I would simply adapt to whatever decision she made. The trip was not creating that reality. It was revealing it. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Rebecca. This time it was a photograph. She and several friends sitting outside a cafe, smiling beneath bright Texas sunshine. A second message followed immediately afterward. "You are awfully quiet today." I looked at the screen for several seconds before locking it again. Because the truth was that I was quiet. Not because I had nothing to say. Because for the first time in a very long time, I was listening instead. People often believe a marriage changes overnight. In my experience, it changes one small compromise at a time. After Rebecca's brunch message, I spent the rest of the weekend paying attention to details I had ignored for months. Not investigating, not spying, simply observing. The difference matters. On Sunday afternoon, she sat across from me in the living room scrolling through her phone while a football game played quietly in the background. Every few minutes a notification appeared. Every few minutes she smiled. Not a polite smile. Not the kind people give strangers. A private smile. The kind reserved for conversations that matter. 20 years ago, I would have asked who she was talking to. 10 years ago, she would have volunteered the answer. Now neither of those things happened. Around dinner time, she mentioned Daniel again. The comment arrived so casually that most people would have missed it. "Daniel says the weather in Colorado is perfect this time of year." She kept looking at her phone while she said it. I looked at her for a moment. "Interesting." She nodded. "His cabin is near a lake. Apparently the views are incredible." There was that word again. His. Not the trip. Not the destination. Him. I noticed how naturally his name entered our conversations now. Almost as naturally as mine once had. That realization bothered me more than the trip itself. Later that evening, I walked through the hallway and glanced at family photographs hanging on the wall. Vacations, anniversaries, birthday parties, 21 years compressed into frames and memories. Looking at those pictures, I realized something uncomfortable. The woman in those photographs still existed, but she was becoming harder to find. Rebecca eventually joined me in the kitchen. You have been quiet all weekend. Maybe. She leaned against the counter. Are you angry? I thought about the question carefully. Angry was not the right word. Anger is loud, temporary. What I felt was quieter than that. More permanent. No, I said honestly. I am thinking. She laughed softly. That sounds dangerous. Then she returned upstairs. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet it told me everything I needed to know. She still believed this situation was about jealousy. She still thought the problem was emotional insecurity. She had completely missed the actual issue. Boundaries are not about control. They are about respect. And respect had been slowly disappearing from our marriage long before Daniel returned. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. Texas winters have a way of feeling undecided. I drove to my office and spent the day reviewing contracts and attending meetings. Yet every quiet moment brought the same thought back to me. Not Daniel. Not the trip. Rebecca's certainty. The certainty that she could make a decision affecting our marriage without discussing it. That confidence had not appeared by accident. It had been built over time, reinforced by years of assumptions. Years of believing I would always adjust, always understand, always remain in place regardless of what happened around me. That evening I received another message from her. A photograph of mountain scenery. Apparently Daniel had sent it. This is where we are staying, she wrote. We. The single word stood out immediately. Earlier it had been a solo trip. Now it was we. I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I locked my phone and placed it on my desk. Because for the first time since all of this began, a strange sense of clarity settled over me. The trip was not the beginning of a problem. It was the confirmation of one. And once you stop arguing with reality, you can finally start deciding what to do about it. The decision was made on a Tuesday afternoon, although nobody except me knew it at the time. Rebecca spent most of the week talking about travel plans, flight times, restaurants, hiking trails, scenic overlooks. Every conversation carried the same assumption, that life would continue exactly as it had before, that I would remain in the background, quietly supporting whatever direction she chose. The confidence was almost impressive. On Wednesday evening, she sat at the kitchen island, comparing hotel photographs on her tablet. The glow from the screen reflected across the granite countertop while she scrolled through images of mountains, lakes, and luxury cabins. You should see this place, she said. The views are incredible. I looked over briefly. A wooden balcony overlooking a lake surrounded by pine trees. It looked peaceful. Looks nice, I said. She smiled. Daniel found it. There was that name again. Effortless. Familiar. Comfortable. Months earlier, hearing it might have irritated me. Now it simply confirmed what I already understood. Rebecca continued describing the trip while I listened quietly. Somewhere during the conversation, I realized something important. She was talking about the future as though the future had already been agreed upon. Not discussed. Not negotiated. Agreed upon. The distinction mattered. After dinner, she disappeared upstairs with her phone. I remained at the table reviewing documents on my laptop. Property records. Retirement accounts. Insurance policies. Nothing secretive. Nothing dishonest. Just information every responsible adult should understand. The more I reviewed, the calmer I became. Facts have a way of reducing emotional noise. By Thursday morning, I scheduled an appointment with an attorney named Charles Bennett. His office occupied the top floor of a modern building overlooking downtown Dallas. Large windows, quiet hallways, neutral artwork hanging on expensive walls. The kind of place designed to encourage serious conversations. Charles was in his early 60s with silver hair and the patient expression of someone who had spent decades listening before speaking. He greeted me professionally and offered coffee. We sat across from each other in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. What brings you in? He asked. I considered the question carefully. Clarity. He smiled slightly. That is usually a good reason. For the next hour, we discussed finances, property ownership, legal protections, and future planning. I never mentioned revenge. I never mentioned punishment. Those were emotional words. I was interested in practical ones. Preparation, structure, options. Charles listened carefully and answered every question. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my car feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because my marriage was improving, because uncertainty was disappearing. Friday arrived quickly. Rebecca seemed excited. She spent the evening packing luggage in our bedroom while music played softly from her phone. I watched her move between closets and suitcases with the energy of someone preparing for an adventure. At one point, she held up 2 jackets and asked which one looked better. The question almost made me laugh. Not because it was funny, because it felt strangely disconnected from reality. Like discussing paint colors while a foundation shifts underneath a house. "The blue one," I said. "Good choice." She smiled and folded it neatly into her suitcase. A few minutes later, her phone lit up on the dresser. A message preview appeared briefly on the screen. "Daniel, looking forward to this." The notification disappeared before she noticed I had seen it. I looked away immediately, not because I was avoiding the truth, because the truth no longer required investigation. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I sat alone on the back patio overlooking the dark backyard. Warm Texas air drifted through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The neighborhood remained peaceful. I thought about the last 21 years. The memories, the sacrifices, the plans. People often imagine life-changing moments arriving with dramatic speeches or emotional confrontations. In reality, they usually arrive quietly. A realization, a decision, a shift in perspective. By the time I finally stood and walked back inside, I understood something with complete certainty. Rebecca still believed the upcoming trip was the story. She had no idea it was only the chapter that revealed how the story would end. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and unusually warm weather for late autumn in Texas. Rebecca woke up before sunrise, energized in a way I had not seen for months. Suitcases stood neatly beside the bedroom door. Travel documents rested on the dresser. Every detail had been planned. Every reservation had been confirmed. Watching her move through the room felt strangely similar to watching someone prepare for a future that no longer included me in the way she imagined. "My flight leaves at 9:30, she said while checking her phone. "I should get to the airport early." I nodded. "Probably a good idea." She paused for a moment, almost disappointed by my calm response. Then, she returned to gathering the last few things she wanted to pack. The drive to Dallas Love Field Airport took about 30 minutes. Traffic was light. Morning sunlight reflected across office buildings and empty parking lots. Rebecca spent most of the ride texting. Occasionally, she smiled at something on the screen. Occasionally, she looked out the window. We exchanged a few ordinary comments about weather and travel. Nothing more. When we arrived at the terminal, she turned toward me. "You are really okay with this?" she asked. It was not the first time she had asked some version of that question. I suspected it would not be the last. "You already made your decision," I said. She studied my face carefully, looking for frustration, looking for resentment, looking for evidence that she still occupied the center of my emotional world. Whatever she expected to find was not there. Finally, she nodded. "I will call you when I land." Then she stepped out of the vehicle, collected her luggage, and disappeared into the terminal. I watched until the crowd swallowed her completely. Then I drove home alone. The house felt different the moment I walked inside. Quieter, larger somehow, not lonely, just honest. For the first time in months, there were no notifications echoing through shared spaces. No conversations revolving around someone else's name. No tension hiding beneath ordinary routines. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. At 11:15, my phone buzzed. Rebecca had landed safely. A photograph accompanied the message. Snow-capped mountains stretched across the horizon beneath a bright blue sky. "Beautiful view," she wrote. I replied with a simple thumbs up. Nothing more. Throughout the afternoon, additional photographs arrived. A lakeside cafe, a hiking trail, a mountain overlook. Each image seemed carefully chosen to communicate happiness, freedom, adventure. The messages felt less like updates and more like performances. By evening, I stopped opening them immediately. Instead, I focused on things that actually required my attention. Financial records, future planning, meetings already scheduled for the following week. Around 7 o'clock, I received a call from Charles Bennett. We discussed several documents and finalized appointments for Monday. The conversation lasted less than 20 minutes. Yet when it ended, I felt more certain than ever that I was moving in the right direction. Not because I wanted revenge, because clarity creates momentum. Later that night, I sat on the back patio, watching the sun disappear beyond the trees. The sky shifted from orange to purple to black. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Rebecca was beginning her vacation. Here in Texas, I was beginning something else entirely. My phone vibrated once more. Another photograph. This time it showed a wooden balcony overlooking a lake surrounded by mountains. The caption underneath was short. "You would love this place." I stared at the image for several seconds before locking the screen. The strange thing was that she was probably right. Years earlier I would have loved it. Years earlier we might have gone there together. Years earlier she might have wanted that. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the evening sounds drifting across the neighborhood. Crickets, wind moving through branches, a distant lawn sprinkler. Ordinary sounds, familiar sounds. Yet beneath them was another realization becoming impossible to ignore. Rebecca believed she was leaving home for a week-long trip. What she did not understand was that the moment her plane left Texas, the future she assumed would be waiting for her had already started changing. Monday morning began with a phone call from Rebecca at exactly 8:12 a.m. I was sitting in Charles Bennett's office reviewing paperwork when my phone vibrated across the conference table. Her name appeared on the screen beside a photograph of the two of us taken years earlier during a beach vacation in Florida. For a moment I stared at it, not because I was unsure whether to answer, because the image felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I accepted the call. "Good morning," she said cheerfully. In the background I could hear wind and distant voices. "Good morning. You sound busy." "I am." She laughed lightly. "Work?" "Something like that." There was a pause. Not long. Just enough for her to realize I was not going to volunteer details. "The mountains are incredible," she said. "You would not believe the views from here." I looked through the glass wall of Charles's conference room toward the Dallas skyline. "I am sure they are." Another pause followed. "You really are being quiet." "Maybe." She laughed again, but this time the sound carried a trace of uncertainty. "Well, Daniel and I are heading out to a hiking trail. I will send pictures later. Enjoy your day." The call ended a few seconds later. Charles looked at me from across the table. He had not asked personal questions since our first meeting. That was one of the reasons I respected him. He focused on facts, plans, decisions. "Ready to continue?" he asked. "Absolutely." The next several hours passed quickly. Documents were reviewed. Recommendations were discussed. Options were clarified. Nothing dramatic happened. No secret investigations. No emotional speeches. Just preparation. The kind that changes lives long before anyone notices. Around noon I stopped for lunch at a small restaurant near downtown. While waiting for my meal, I checked my phone. 7 unread messages from Rebecca. Most contained photographs. Mountain trails. Lakes. Restaurant patios. Scenic overlooks. One photograph included Daniel standing beside her beneath a wooden sign at a trailhead. Both of them were smiling. The caption underneath read, "Great day so far." Looking at the image, I felt surprisingly little. Not anger. Not jealousy. Mostly confirmation. Every new message reinforced the same conclusion. Rebecca was focused entirely on the experience she was having. She never once asked what I was doing. Never once asked what I was thinking. Never once asked how the previous weeks had affected me. That realization stayed with me during the drive home. By Tuesday, the pattern continued. More photographs. More updates. More stories about mountain towns and lakeside cafes. Rebecca seemed determined to document every moment. The messages arrived throughout the day as though she expected me to play the role of audience. On Wednesday afternoon, she sent a short text. "You seem distant lately." I stared at the words for several seconds before setting the phone aside. Distant. The irony almost made me smile. Physical distance can be measured in miles. Emotional distance takes longer to recognize. That evening I sat alone on the back patio watching sunlight fade behind the trees. My phone remained silent for nearly 2 hours. Then another message arrived. This one was different. No photograph. No travel update. Just a question. "Are you upset with me?" I looked at the screen. Read the words once. Then again. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, Rebecca was finally beginning to sense that something had changed. Not because I had argued. Not because I had made demands. Because silence has a way of revealing truths that conversations often hide. I typed a response. 3 simple words. "We will talk." Her reply arrived almost immediately. "About what?" I locked the phone without answering. The evening air moved gently through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor closed a garage door. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet for the first time since Rebecca boarded her flight, I sensed a shift occurring. She still believed the story was about a trip. She still believed the important events were happening in the mountains. What she did not understand was that the most important decisions were being made back in Texas. And by the time she finally came home, many of those decisions would already be complete. Rebecca's flight landed in Dallas on Friday evening, just before sunset. I knew the exact arrival time because she had sent it 3 days earlier along with a message that simply read, "Looking forward to being home." The wording stayed with me. Home. It is a powerful word. More powerful than most people realize. Home is not a building. It is not a mortgage payment. It is not an address printed on legal documents. Home is trust. And once trust begins to disappear, the meaning of everything else changes with it. Around 6 o'clock, I was sitting in the living room reviewing a folder of documents when my phone vibrated. Landed safely, Rebecca wrote. See you soon. I looked at the message and placed the phone back on the table. Outside, the sky was turning shades of orange and gold as the sun settled. Behind the trees, the neighborhood remained quiet. Children rode bicycles down the street. A neighbor walked his dog along the sidewalk. Ordinary life continued exactly as it always had. 40 minutes later, headlights appeared in the driveway. I watched through the front window as Rebecca stepped out of a rideshare vehicle. She looked relaxed, rested, happy. A week in the mountains had clearly done its job. She pulled her suitcase behind her and walked toward the front door with the confidence of someone expecting everything to be exactly where she left it. The door opened. "I am home," she announced. Her voice echoed through the entryway. I remained seated in the living room. "Welcome back." She wheeled her suitcase inside and stopped when she saw me. Something in my expression must have caught her attention because her smile faded slightly. Not completely, just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath it. "That is quite a greeting," she said with a small laugh. "Long trip?" "Very." She sat down across from me. "The mountains were amazing. You would have loved the scenery." I nodded. I saw the pictures. For a few minutes she talked about restaurants, hiking trails, mountain lakes, and local shops. The stories flowed easily, yet every few sentences she paused, waiting for something. A reaction, a question, an emotional response. When none arrived, the conversation slowly lost momentum. Finally, she looked directly at me. "Michael, what is going on?" There it was. The question she should have asked weeks earlier. I folded my hands and considered her carefully. "You told me during the trip that I seemed distant." She nodded. "Because you did. You were right." Silence settled between us. Rebecca shifted slightly in her chair. "Okay," she said cautiously. "Why?" I glanced toward the folder resting on the coffee table, then back at her. "Because I spent the last few weeks paying attention." Her expression tightened. Paying attention to what? Us. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not defensive, not angry, uncomfortable. Because deep down, she already knew where this conversation was leading. The trip had given her distance from the marriage. My silence had given me perspective on it. "Michael, if this is about Daniel." I raised a hand gently, not to stop her, to slow the conversation down. "This is not about Daniel." She blinked. "Then what is it about?" "It is about the fact that somewhere along the way you stopped treating our marriage like a partnership." The room became very quiet. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. Inside, neither of us moved. Rebecca looked away first, toward the hallway lined with family photographs, toward 21 years of shared history frozen behind glass frames. "I did not mean to hurt you," she said softly. I believed her. That was the problem. Intentions matter, but consequences matter too. People often cause the most damage when they stop paying attention to the effect their choices have on others. I reached for the folder on the coffee table and placed it between us. Rebecca stared at it, then at me, then back at the folder again. Her expression changed slowly as realization began to settle in. She had spent the entire week assuming the important events were happening somewhere else. Only now was she beginning to understand that while she had been away, another story had been unfolding right here at home. Rebecca stared at the folder for several seconds without touching it. The room felt unusually quiet. Even the familiar sounds of the house seemed distant somehow. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. A clock ticked somewhere down the hallway. Ordinary sounds. Yet nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Finally, she reached forward and opened the folder. The first few pages contained financial summaries, property records, account structures. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts. Rebecca flipped through them slowly. The confidence she had carried through the front door less than an hour earlier was disappearing page by page. "What is all this?" she asked quietly. "Information." She looked up at me. "Information for what?" I leaned back in my chair. "For decisions." The answer seemed to unsettle her more than any accusation could have. Because accusations create arguments. Decisions create consequences. She continued reading. Several pages contained recommendations prepared by professionals. Financial planning options. Asset protection strategies. Long-term considerations. Everything organized neatly. Everything complete. Nothing had been done impulsively. That detail mattered. Rebecca placed the papers back inside the folder and looked directly at me. "You talked to an attorney." It was not a question. "Yes." Her expression tightened. "While I was gone." "Yes." Another silence settled between us. The kind that appears when reality finally catches up to assumptions. Outside, darkness had fully settled across the neighborhood. Reflections from the living room windows turned the glass into mirrors. Rebecca looked away first. "So that is what this week was really about." "Partly." She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "I thought you were angry." "I was disappointed." "That is different." "Very." She lowered her eyes toward the folder again. For the first time since Daniel's name had re-entered our lives, she seemed to understand that the issue had never been jealousy. Jealousy is emotional, temporary. This was something else entirely. "Michael," she said carefully, "nothing happened." I nodded. "I know." The response surprised her. She blinked. "You know?" "I believe you." That answer seemed to leave her even more unsettled. Because if this was not about proving something happened, then the conversation moved somewhere far more uncomfortable. Toward choices. Toward priorities. Toward respect. Rebecca sat quietly for several moments. Then she spoke again. "If you believe me, why are we here?" I looked toward the family photographs lining the hallway wall. 21 years of memories captured in smiling moments. Birthdays. Vacations. Holidays. Entire chapters of life frozen behind glass. "Because a marriage can be damaged long before anyone breaks a promise," I said. She followed my gaze toward the photographs. Neither of us spoke. Eventually she looked back at me. "I never thought you would react like this." There it was. The truth hidden beneath everything else. Not the trip. Not Daniel. Expectation. She had expected frustration. Expected arguments. Expected forgiveness. She had never expected distance. She had never expected me to stop chasing explanations and start accepting reality. "I know," I said quietly. Rebecca lowered her head. For the first time that evening she looked tired. Not physically. Emotionally. The week she had spent enjoying mountain views and lakeside mornings suddenly seemed very far away. "What happens now?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. It deserved an honest answer. "Now we stop pretending this is about one trip." She looked at me silently. "Waiting. Now we talk about everything that existed before the trip ever happened." Her eyes filled with realization. Not dramatic realization. The quiet kind. The kind that arrives when someone finally sees the full picture instead of a single event. The messages. The distance. The assumptions. The disappearing boundaries. The slow erosion of partnership. None of it had started last week. Last week had simply revealed it. Rebecca closed the folder and rested both hands on top of it. The gesture felt symbolic somehow, like someone recognizing the weight of something they had previously dismissed. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We simply sat there in the silence of a house that suddenly felt more honest than it had in years. And as I watched her process everything that had happened, I realized the most important part of this story was never the trip she chose to take. It was the moment she finally understood that while she had been focused on protecting her freedom, she had almost forgotten to protect her marriage. The conversation that night lasted for hours. Not because either of us was trying to win. Because for the first time in a very long time, neither of us was hiding behind assumptions. Rebecca asked questions. I answered them. Sometimes she agreed. Sometimes she did not. But the most important difference was that she finally listened. Really listened. In the weeks that followed, life did not transform overnight. Real life rarely works that way. There were difficult conversations. Awkward silences. Moments when old habits tried to return. Yet something fundamental had changed. The illusion was gone. The comfortable belief that a marriage could survive indefinitely on history alone had disappeared. Both of us now understood that relationships are not protected by years. They are protected by choices. One decision at a time. Winter eventually turned into spring. The oak trees in our neighborhood filled with green leaves again. The backyard garden Rebecca had once ignored slowly came back to life. Some evenings we sat outside together without phones, without distractions, without conversations about people who did not belong in our marriage. Other evenings we simply enjoyed the silence. Healthy silence feels different from distant silence. One creates separation. The other creates peace. About 6 months later, I received a message while sitting on the patio. The sender's name immediately caught my attention. Daniel. The message itself was short, respectful. He apologized for any role he may have played in creating tension. He explained that he had never intended to become a source of conflict. I read it once and then set my phone down. The strange thing was that I felt no anger toward him. Not because he was perfect, because the real lesson had never been about him. People often focus on the third person who appears in a story. The truth is that the most important decisions are usually made by the two people already inside the relationship. Later that evening, I showed the message to Rebecca. She read it quietly and handed the phone back. Neither of us said much. There was nothing left to analyze. Some chapters simply end when everyone finally understands what they were supposed to learn. A year after the trip, I found myself standing beside the lake near our neighborhood during an early morning walk. The water reflected the sunrise like polished glass. The air was cool, peaceful. I thought about the man sitting at the kitchen table months earlier staring at a message that changed everything. At the time, it felt like the beginning of a crisis. Looking back, it was actually the beginning of clarity. The message did not destroy anything. It revealed something. There is an important difference. Destruction removes what exists. Revelation exposes what was already there. The distance, the assumptions, the missing boundaries, the lack of attention. None of those things appeared suddenly. They had been growing quietly for years. The trip merely turned on the light. As I continued walking along the shoreline, I realized something else. The most powerful decision I made was not meeting with an attorney. It was not reviewing documents. It was not creating plans. The most powerful decision was refusing to react emotionally to something that required clarity instead. Had I chosen anger, I would have spent weeks arguing about details. By choosing calm, I was forced to examine the larger picture. And the larger picture changed everything. When people hear stories like this, they often ask what happened in the end. Did someone win? Did someone lose? I think that is the wrong question. Real life is not always about victory. Sometimes it is about understanding. Sometimes it is about recognizing a problem before it becomes permanent. Sometimes it is about remembering that respect is not maintained through promises. It is maintained through daily choices. As the sun climbed higher above the lake, I turned toward home. The same home that had once felt uncertain. The same home that had become the setting for difficult truths and necessary decisions. And as I walked, one thought stayed with me. Jealousy fades. Anger fades. Even disappointment fades. But the moment you finally see reality clearly can change the entire direction of your life. That was the real story. Not a trip. Not a message. Not another man. Just a husband who stopped arguing with what he saw and started paying attention to what it meant.